Morning. I'm Clarke, and I'm here to present the no side of the second debate for this week's case study regarding PCA and salmonella poisoning. My first argument is third-party communicators should not provide an ethical critique during a crisis. In a crisis, objective communication that is factual is what is needed to aid the victims and resolve the crisis. Third-party proxy communicators should not practice ethical critiques as part of their communication during a crisis, since it will divert attention from the facts, the information the public needs, and in this case, focus on PCA's misguided and potentially criminal behavior. In short, providing an ethical critique develops an ad hominem attack on PCA instead of helping the public. In our readings, Habermas identified 4 assumptions necessary for ethical communications. If the third-party proxy communicators stay within Habermas's 4 assumptions, the public will develop a level of trust, and appropriate steps to resolving the salmonella crisis can proceed. In a crisis, the first thing to disappear is trust. In the absence of trust, honest ethical communication is not possible. In the case regarding PCA, the third-party communicators have a vested interest in ensuring that only factual data is released. This permits people to trust the information they receive and permits everyone to focus on what they need to know or learn. This eases the crisis and begins the resolution aspect of the crisis. Habermas's 4 key assumptions to ethical communications are: the statements can be understood, are true, agreed upon factual states of affairs, the statements accurately reflect the intentions of others, and last, they are in harmony with relevant shared social values and rules. The classic public relations crisis management case of Tylenol in the 1980s demonstrates the positive impact of taking a position that follows Habermas's key assumptions. In 1982, in Chicago, someone tampered with bottles of Tylenol, replacing the painkiller with cyanide and resulting in 7 deaths. Johnson & Johnson, the parent company, took immediate action by asking the nation, in ads and through the media, to stop taking any Tylenol product, pulled all of its Tylenol products from the shelves, and established a 24-hour hotline for any citizen to call at any time. Johnson & Johnson's initial response and subsequent messaging was, the safety of the consumer comes first. And this fulfilled Habermas's 4 assumptions. This example is now considered the benchmark for crisis management in the public relations industry. My second argument against providing an ethical critique during a crisis involves the politicization of a crisis. Third-party proxy communicators should not practice ethical critiques as part of their communications, since it politicizes the crisis, putting opinion and organizational needs ahead of the public and potentially creating even greater levels of mistrust amongst the public. In a crisis, people search for answers and information. There is a need for ethical communication to help the victims and to prevent others from becoming victims. By politicizing the event, third-party communicators treat people as a means to an organizational end. In doing so, they risk misleading the public, they risk creating an environment that lacks trust in any information that is being disseminated, heightening the crisis and perhaps creating more victims, and they ultimately lose the respect and the attention of the public they are trying to serve. In the midst of the PCA crisis, people across the country were searching for information on what was safe to eat and how to deal with salmonella poisoning. Using the public as a means to further an organizational goal could have put the public at greater risk. Politicizing the PCA event places the emphasis on the third-party communicators as opposed to the greater good. This undermines the public trust in that communicator and potentially prolongs the crisis. A utilitarian viewpoint suggests that the greater good, not the organizational good, should be the focal point of honest ethical communications. James Griffin points out that there are 2 types of decision-making processes in regard to social utility: practical and reflective. In reflective decision-making, Griffin asks, what should we as a society do in a given situation? There are numerous examples of politicized events in our society, and most are distasteful. Within hours of the most recent tragedy in Parkland, Florida, both sides of the political spectrum were accusing each other of politicizing the event. It demonstrated a serious lack of respect for the victims, did not create an environment of trust, and certainly we are no closer to ending this sort of tragedy today than we were when the tragedy actually occurred. An organizational good is being served rather than the greater good. As a society, the first response to Parkland should not be to defend or forward a political perspective, but rather clearly understand what went wrong, so what needs to be done to prevent future tragedies of this nature can be clearly identified. This requires honest, objective communications with the public, much like Johnson & Johnson and Tylenol. In the PCA case study, the third-party communicators can answer the question of what should we do as a society by providing the public with factual, objective information that provides victims and the general public with advice on product safety and how to recognize and deal with salmonella poisoning, and then permit appropriate questions to be asked in order to prevent future crises of this nature. Thank you all, and I do appreciate your patience. I know I'm turning this in very late. Again, I appreciate your tolerance and patience.